Well, good morning again. I decided to kind of change gears this morning. I've been going through Romans for what seems like a long time, so we're going to go to another book today. Still talking about the same thing pretty much, still talking about Christ and His work, and that's why we come together. I hope we can all understand that this book's about Christ, from the start to the end. Jesus Christ is the author through the Spirit. Jesus Christ is the subject, and that's what this is all about. But today we're going to try to focus in on really two very important subjects. And this sermon may be really long or really short. We'll just see how it turns out. But if you would open with me to Hebrews 6, just a little backstory about the book of Hebrews. It is the key to interpretation of the Old Testament. That's what it was really written for, to understand the purpose of the Old Testament. And really, to me, it's written pretty simply as far as even a guy like me can understand it and understand all the huge themes of the Old Testament here presented as it is elaborated for us by the Spirit in Hebrews. And it was written primarily to those that had a very familiar grasp of the Old Testament. They may have understood a lot of things from it, but they needed to understand that it was about Christ. So that's what we have to do. That's what we have to do to understand the Old Testament, is to see it through the lens of Christ, to see it as it was intended, to see it in its fullness in the purpose of the plan of redemption of God. So last week we talked quite a bit about faith. We talked quite a bit about how is it that a man or a woman takes hold of the promises of God. And we saw quite a few things. We saw that faith is required from man to take hold of God's promises. That we're not saved through faith, through the greatness of our faith, or through any kind of merit of our own, but by grace we're saved through faith. So it is the grace that saves us. It's the faith through which we acquire that salvation. And we can't ever get those things mixed up. So many people really struggle with that. So it's the provision made by God through Christ that saves us. That's it. It's our faith that allows us to take hold of that. So today we're going to talk about really Christ being our priest. And I know we've talked about this really quite a bit, but we're going to try to kind of take it as a different angle. And I would argue that a lot of people, even myself included, struggle today in the faith, struggle today in confidence, in assurance, and even struggle, unfortunately, still with sin. So what's our answer to that? How is it that we can stop the struggle? Because I really think we can. I really think that we can live in peace that Christ provides. And that's always going to be under attack, as we know, as we talked about many times in the process of sanctification, as the flesh is always going to attack that. The world's always going to attack that. And ultimately we have an enemy. And Satan and all his little minions are going to attack that too. But I want you to understand that we can still have peace because the God that lives in us is greater than all of that. Greater than our shortcomings, greater than the shortcomings of the world, greater than the adversary. So we have to be able to grasp a few things. And like I said, we went through a lot of this before. And I really don't have that many passages today as a surprise. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit more today and read a little less, but we're still going to read quite a bit. So starting in Hebrews chapter 6, this will kind of introduce it. And we're going to focus on verse 20, but I'm going to read 13 through 20. So starting in 6:13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, so that right there says a lot. We went through that. I hope we can all remember the Abrahamic covenant. Since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself. That is, that the Abrahamic covenant was unconditional. That God himself swore that it would take place by himself, therefore ensuring that it would take place, okay? Saying, surely I will bless and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. And that's talking about even human beings do this. So to the heirs of the promise, So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. So God has swore that these things would happen. That's the simple understanding. So that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. So just as we talked last week about faith, and some people no doubt have stronger faith than others, but here's how we are to strengthen our faith, whether it is strong now or whether it needs a little strengthening. Here's how it takes place. We have to understand we fled for refuge. We have to understand we're encouragement. There's a hope set before us, and as we've talked about before, a hope in biblical terms is not an unsure thing, it's a guaranteed thing. So 19. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. An anchor of the soul You could preach a whole sermon on that, using an illustration of a boat floating freely in the sea and then anchored. I talked about the comparison. I almost did that, but let's continue. A hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. Now we're getting into an Old Testament reference, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf. And the forerunner, having become the high priest, and this is our focus verse here, having become the high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So we have to understand that Christ is a high priest forever, and we are so prone to forget that. We're also prone to forget why that's necessary. I think all problems we have in the Christian walk, as far as being sanctified, being more like Christ, because we're all called to do that, there's no doubt. The struggles we have is when we misunderstand God. I have a relationship with my earthly father, okay? If I don't know him very well, then our relationship isn't very good. Not that I don't have one. It's that our relationship really is kind of stagnant, that we probably won't communicate much and thus and such. So that's a human illustration. I would argue that a lot of people really misunderstand the character of God, misunderstand just God in general. They don't know a whole lot about Him. They may know a lot about the Bible. They don't know a lot about God Himself. So I think, here's what I'll say, a disclaimer. Without knowing the Bible, you can't know God. Without special revelation, God's self-revelation, it's impossible to know anything about God. But you can know the Bible and not know God. So we have to be able to put those two together. So the first thing we really have to see to understand the need of Jesus being a priest, to understand the work of Jesus as a priest, we're going to briefly touch on kind of priests in the Old Testament, what's that symbolize, but really not even to get too deep into that, because we've been into that very deep before. Not even get too deep into that. We have to understand that really what does that represent? What are we saying when we say we need a priest before God? Why is that? So let's go to Exodus chapter 19. And like I said, we won't be flipping around here as much as we usually do. But Exodus chapter 19. And just a little backstory. I think as Christians, the story of the Exodus is very familiar. It's almost sometimes too familiar that we miss a lot of really what's revealed in the Exodus. But the Exodus, the children of Israel brought out from bondage, a 400-year bondage to a nation that was extremely intolerant, extremely evil, brought out by signs and wonders, by the mighty hand of God, led through the long way, so to speak, through the wilderness, and really for a purpose so that God could prove Himself faithful so that He could build their faith. They are led ultimately to the base of a mountain. They are led to the base of a mountain called Mount Sinai. So this is where Exodus 19 takes place. So they have had so much revelation of God given to them. They've had so much demonstration of God given to them through His power, through His providence, outward signs, inward signs, manna, quail, just gifted to them from heaven. Literally from heaven, they've seen miraculous signs. So just a commercial. So many people say today that I'll believe in God if He would just come down and speak to me, or if He'd give me a quail or some manna. I got news for you. And millions of people saw that take place and still disbelieved. So the issue is not an issue of outward signs or an issue of evidence, but an issue of an inward faith. And that's what we have to build here as Christians. To see God truly, I would say the chief attribute of God is holiness. So many people really don't understand that. And it is, in a way, a very terrifying concept to grasp, that God's holy, and you're not, and I'm not. So to understand the need for a priest, to understand the need for Christ to stand in my stead, to stand constantly before the throne of God and make intercession for me, is to understand the holiness of God, and to understand the unholiness of myself and the separation. So we'll see that here in Exodus 19. So as I say, even in the giving of the law here, even in God's outward manifestation of His holiness here on this mountain, we can see that Israel has already been delivered. Okay, so in no way does the law play any part in salvation. Okay, in fact, Israel had been saved in the sense of nationally, corporately saved, and they had been led and shown by God a more deeper object of their faith to be built up. Okay, so at this point, they're not receiving this in hopes of any kind of spiritual salvation or physical salvation. This is a separate issue, I would argue. So we're going to see the presence of God, and we're going to go in chapter 19, we'll start in verse 12. So a lot of things have happened up to this point. I just gave you a brief overview. So at this point, the entire nation, which is roughly, some people estimate 1 million people, Some people estimate 2 to 3 million people, and there's a lot of disagreement on that. I would argue that it's at least 1 million people, probably more than that. For 400 years, these people were in bondage, and they were led out. So you can imagine, how long would it take for just this congregation to cross a body of water the size of the Red Sea that's parted? It would take, I don't know, 30 minutes just for us to walk across. Imagine 1 million people. So imagine how much manna, which was just a fine flour bread-like substance, would it take to sustain just this congregation, or how many quail? I mean, I could probably eat 6 or 7 quails. You know what I'm saying? but how many are we talking about to sustain 1 million people? The signs of God given to this nation are immense. I'm talking about manna that would fill up Scott County. We're talking about, I mean, we're not talking about tiny little, like, oh, you know, this might be real here. So after God has shown these people so many things, He leads them to this base of this mountain. And now, here's a very interesting fact. I said I was going to read this verse. I'm going to get there. Here's a very interesting thing. That Moses in Exodus 3 was given a sign of God, an outward manifestation of God. And what we have to understand, God is a spirit. God is transcendent, okay? He is so far above us that we can't grasp anything about Him. And without Him coming down and stooping to our level, we never would. So God gives Moses this self-disclosure of Himself by giving him His name, but ultimately through an outward sign of a burning bush. And that's at Mount Horeb, if you go back and see in Exodus 3. And this is the exact same location. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that. So God comes to Moses and institutes him as the mediator of this new covenant, the Mosaic covenant here in Exodus 3, that leads him through deliverance up back to the same point. So God's self-revelation to Moses is one of grace. Okay? Not that Moses and the children of Israel didn't really understand God's holiness, but they did not grasp it to the full. Okay? So the self-revelation of God through the burning bush to Moses and ultimately to the children of Israel is done at the same place to start with in Exodus 3, brought back here to the base of the mountain. Now this is what we have to grasp about God. Apart from the Christian understanding of God, there is no reconciling God's holiness and justice with God's love and kindness. The only reconciliation that all other religions offer is that you have to come and put these two together through your actions. Okay, God's holiness and justice, God's grace and kindness, and these two things are basically a contradiction. So that all religions either say, He's so gracious, you do whatever you want, it don't matter, you're going to make it, or He's so just and so holy that you have to be holy in yourself. And that's the distinction here. And we have to understand that the Christian view of God is that He is so holy that there is no way to Him for you. So here's what this is going to illustrate. I believe in Corinthians, I believe Paul calls this the ministry of death. That's what the law is. We have to understand that God is unapproachable by us. There is no way for me to live in the holiness of God. I will be destroyed. So this is what this illustrates. As it was a gracious illustration in Exodus 3, it is not a gracious illustration here. It is a terrible, terrifying illustration. So, in Exodus 19, we'll start in verse 12. It says, "And you," that's talking about Moses, "shall set limits for the people all around." And this is around the mountain, so they camp at the base. Okay? "Take care not to go up into the mountain. Touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death." That's immediately. Okay? And now this is talking about verse 13. "No hand shall touch him." That's anybody that broke this commandment and touched the mountain while the presence of God was there. "But he shall be stoned or shot," and that is shot with an arrow. "Whether beast," and now we're talking about even livestock that's traveling with you, "beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain." Now, can we really grasp that? What he's saying is, if anybody even touches the mountain, and just as we saw when Moses was encountered a burning bush, he said, "Take off your shoes, this is holy ground." He graciously allowed Moses to come into his self-revelation. Here there is no grace. Okay, we have to see the distinction. Here he says, even if you touch it. Okay, now Moses stood in the presence of God. He says, even if you touch it, you're going to be stoned immediately. And he said, you can't even touch the guy that does this. So we're talking about, this is an illustration of the separateness of God and man, of the holiness of God and the absolute corruption of man. We have to be able to grasp these things. We have to understand that we're no different than these people. Okay, if we were in their shoes, we go touch that mountain, we die. There is no distinction there. So let's move down just a quick, same chapter, move down to verse 16, and we'll read through 25. So starting in 16, "On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled." Okay, so they understood this very, very well. And the biblical notion of trembling Seems very undersold. These people were scared. I want you to understand absolute fear. Okay. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They took their stand at the foot of the mountain. So we had millions of people, potentially, gathered at the base of this mountain. And I don't know, I've seen a few proposed pictures of where this mountain could have been. But all the pictures I've ever seen, it's a very scary place just to look at now. Okay, so you can imagine what it looks like with the presence of God on it. So it's a very steep, but the places I've seen proposed are extremely steep. I'm talking about, and it's to illustrate very vivid truth, but very intimidating spot. Okay, now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. And you can see that the fire of grace in the bush and the fire of law are very distinct, both of which are outward manifestations of God, but different. Okay, so the smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. So not only are the people trembling, but the earth itself is trembling. Okay, and as the sound of the trumpets grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. That's not amazing. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So we can see this idea of a mediator. But anyway, and the Lord said to Moses, "Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord, to look, and many of them perish." So God veils His presence here through this smoke. Okay, so now He's saying, He's already said, you touch it, you die. He's saying, if you were to even see me, you die. So I have graciously planted the smoke around my presence so that you may not die. Do you see the separation of God? And how without Christ, just a disclaimer to the end of this sermon, without Christ, this is where man is. Separate, dead, no hope. And that has to be plainly understood here. To understand the idea of Christ as our high priest, we have to understand for what? For what purpose? For why? Why can I be my own priest? Why can I do my own thing? It's very apparent here when we understand this illustration. So, go down and warn the people lest they break through, and the Lord, to look at the Lord, and many of them perish. So even to gaze upon this holiness is instant perishing. Okay, so also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. Now Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain and consecrate it." Okay, so the Lord said to him, "Go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest He break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. Now, that's a mouthful, but it's really showing the presence of God. And how is it that we can reconcile this God who's so loving, as we know, who gave a provision of His only Son, who God incarnate came and took on the sin problem upon His own self, and a mighty God that is separate from all humanity, a God that really in Himself, just in His being, cannot be with man, cannot strive with man. How is it that we can answer that question? I would argue we have to understand this idea of Jesus being a priest. So many people would love to say that, Jesus saved me, and I love Him very much, I appreciate His grace, but now He requires me to basically be pretty much perfect. So what we have to understand is that through sanctification we can all become more like Christ, but that's still His work, that's still Him doing it through us. And we have to be able to understand the freedom we have in Christ. We have to be able to understand what exactly is Christ doing. Did He just come and die, and now He's basically just kind of, hanging out, waiting for the second coming? He's not really busy at work. So in Exodus 19, at the base of the mountain, it demonstrates the holiness and transcendence of God, and the inability of man to approach such a God, even to look, let alone to be with, to be in the presence of. And in Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments are given, and that's ultimately for the same purpose, okay, to demonstrate to man, not only in an outward physical smoke sign or a command given that not even a beast can touch, but now we're going to write it down on tablets to put it before you continually, that the holiness of God and the sinfulness of man are completely in contradiction. Okay, so we can see from the fall onward also, now I'm going to kind of switch gears just a touch, we can also see from the fall onward the doctrine of substitutionary atonement. We talked about that quite a bit. And that is sin demands death, and instead of the believer who has faith in God dying because of the sin, a substitute is offered. So from Abraham to Moses, this practice is upheld, and without really a corporate idea. So all for the same purpose. And now, here's another commercial. I really like these commercials. Hear me very clearly on this, because a lot of people, I want you to understand, most religions have sacrifice built in. From the start to the end, even pagan religions today still sacrifice things. So how is it that we can say that that's not archaic, or that God somehow isn't just a figment and we just all just come to these conclusions? So the difference between the sacrifice in our worldview, the Jewish sacrifice of an animal, say to the sacrifice of a goat to Aphrodite, or the sacrifice of a bull in the Hindu system, okay, how is this different? And here's the answer. It's much different. It's so different that it's really not even comparable. The meaning of the sacrifice is what's different. Even if the method was identical, the meaning is so different. In all other religions, sacrifices are given to a supposed deity in order to receive something, okay? In order to say, I've done this, so you do this. I have done this by this prescribed way, so now it should rain. Or I've done this, so now all of our women should be able to get pregnant. And that's not me making that up. That's what some people actually believe. So I've done this, you do this. The Christian understanding, the Judeo-Christian understanding of sacrifice, is you do it so that you don't get something. Okay? You see how different that is. You do it so that you don't get what you deserve. You don't do it to deserve something. The sacrifice is given so that you don't get what you do deserve. Very distinct there. Okay? So to say that in any way the sacrifices given in Exodus are in any way comparable to other religious sacrifices is completely insane. Okay, so that's just a commercial. I don't know if anybody's ever heard that. Some people say that stuff. So they're not comparable. So as the Mosaic covenant becomes a reality, we can see the limits set by God and a priestly line established. So let's turn to Leviticus. And we'll look at Leviticus 16. I preached on this before, so I won't go into great detail. And I'm going to give you just a broad understanding of this idea. So these people, in spite of all their sin, and even while Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days, they're at the base of the mountain, and they make a golden calf and worship an idol. Okay, so how do you explain that? It's really hard to grasp how that's possible. To see the greatness of God and the fullness of God's character presented. So you can see God as a gracious God, as a God that's mighty to save, a God that keeps His covenant, a God that keeps His promise, a God that preserves His people, a God that leads them by the great way, the God that walks stride for stride with man. Then, not only that, you can see that you don't deserve that. You can see that God is a holy God, a God that has to bestow grace, and you can see all these things. That's what they saw. And it didn't even take a full month for them to completely abandon that. Okay, so what we have to understand is the reason we don't abandon that like them is because we're indwelt by the Spirit. The reason we don't act as though they did, the reason we keep the faith is because Christ is in heaven on our behalf. We have to grasp that. Okay, we have to rest in that. And that's the only way we're going to grow. That's the only way we're going to actually become further sanctified, is to say that I understand the ministry of Christ in heaven on my behalf. I trust that. I let that go. I quit trying to be my own priest, and I walk after Christ. Okay. So anyway, just a quick, very inefficient, but very quick understanding of this idea of a priest. So you have the tabernacle that was given from God in the Exodus. Now that's why Moses was up there for a long amount of time. He got quite a bit of information. So he gets this tabernacle design, and all that's to illustrate, once again, the same thing that was outwardly illustrated by the smoke, by the prohibition to touch the mountain. All that is basically summarized in the tabernacle. Okay, just a very quick definition. It's a summation of the separateness of God and man, and the fact that a substitution has to be made, and that righteousness has to be imputed from the greater to the lesser. Okay, and that's a very archaic definition. So it was set up, and priests were set up to intercede on the behalf of the nation, to intercede on the behalf of God's people. So that's set up. In Leviticus chapter 16, we're just going to read a couple verses to kind of see. It all basically reaches its climax in one day. There's a lot of stuff to be taught from about the practice of sacrifice, about the different types of sacrifice, and how Christ fulfills all those. But it all reaches its summation on the Day of Atonement. And ultimately, that's what it's all leading up to every year. And the book of Hebrews says that this whole Levitical system of sacrifice was a yearly reminder of sin. It brought nobody full redemption. And they all understood that. The ones that cared enough to actually study, the ones that cared enough and were actually redeemed by God, they understood, just as Peter says, they searched and inquired carefully to what time Christ in them indicated that He would come. Okay, now that's a very deep statement. But these people understood that this right here is not the end-all be-all. That this right here is a foreshadowing of something much greater. I believe they understood that. I believe they understood that because it was set up to be repeated. And that's what Hebrews would argue as well. So starting in Leviticus 16, we'll start in verse 2. And it says, "And the Lord said to Moses," okay, "Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat." And I hope we can all remember what those are. I don't have time to extremely explain that. That is on the ark, so that they may not die. So once again, we see the idea of God's holiness as presented on that mountain carries over into the idea of God's holiness as presented in this, past this veil, the veil that ripped when Christ was crucified and died. That's the same veil here. So we can see the holiness of God, the sinfulness of man. "For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. But in this way Aaron shall come into the holy place with a bull from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat, shall have the linen undergarment on his body. He shall tie the linen sash around his waist, wear the linen turban. And these are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water and put them on. He shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering, 1 ram for a burnt offering." So we have this ceremony described, and I have went through that ceremony at length. And it's amazing to see what all that really means. But ultimately, it's quite simple. It's that to come to God, you have to come different than what you are. That's what he's saying. "Aaron, you're going to have to do these things, man. Okay? You can't make it in there. You're going to die. So I'm going to tell you how to do it. I'm going to give you a ceremony that illustrates, ultimately, my plan of redemption. And I want you to understand that all people, nobody has ever entered the presence of God apart from being under the blood of Christ. Now, that is a little bit harder to grasp without the full revelation of God. But we, especially, that have the book of Hebrews, have no excuse to misunderstand these things. That takes a little bit of time. But we have to see that the plan of redemption of God is a progressive revelation. That it goes from the garden where God made skins and clothed Adam and Eve. That is the exact same thing that happened to us. Ultimately, we're in a different time. But this is the same idea that God is a God that saves. That God saves. That man doesn't. Man can't. That God does. But we have to understand the character of God and the fact that that's very completely gracious and not meritorious on our part. So we see that ceremony offered. We see Aaron having to basically do exactly what God prescribed. And all those elements in that ceremony really illustrate and give a deeper understanding of the ministry of Christ. But we won't go into all those. So moving in the same chapter up to verse 16. And it says, "Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel and because of their transgressions, all their sins. And so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which dwells with them in the midst of their uncleanness. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out, has made atonement for himself, for his house, for the assembly of Israel." So we can see that this is a very overarching thing. That even in its, and this is when it's established, that even when it's established, it's set up to be temporary. You can see even you have to make atonement for not only the sins of the people, but the uncleanliness of the environment, the uncleanness of the tabernacle because of its inability to actually save, the uncleanness of the priest because he's not ultimately the high priest. All these things are progressive, set up to be fulfilled at one moment in time. We have to understand that. So, just to put all that in summary, the reason the Bible's 66 books, ultimately one story, is quite simple. Because God chose to progressively reveal to man the plan of redemption. That because God, desiring man to be saved simply by his grace, because after man has fallen, that's what it requires. Because there is no way back for man, that gap is unbridgeable. Simply by God's grace, he chose to institute a plan to save man. And without Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, all these books that we're like, gosh, I just want to read Matthew. You know what I'm saying? Let's just get out of here. Without these books, there is no Matthew. I want you to understand that. Without Exodus, Genesis, all these books that seem so out of date, like, gosh, what are we talking about? Ashes and stuff and all that. Without these books, I want you to understand, without these books, Christ's work is not fully understood. It's not. You can't understand when it says that the Son of God, in the form of God, laid aside his prerogatives, laid aside his heavenly dwelling, and became man. We have to understand that the same God that comes down on this mountain and deserves so much reverence that you can't even look at him. Okay? Same God comes down and takes on the form of a servant and serves you and serves me. And that's why we're saved. And not only that, and that sacrifice, that substitution is enough to make you not guilty, but it's not enough to make you righteous. So, not only did Christ come and be the atonement, he came to be the righteousness. He came to give you the righteousness that he merited. So, let's go to Hebrews, back to Hebrews. We'll go to chapter 7, so we'll move forward a chapter from where we started. See, I'm real close in there today, not a whole lot. So Hebrews chapter 7, we'll just look at a few verses. We'll start in verse 22. You know, I'm telling you, you can just read Hebrews, and if you understand it, you couldn't even read because you cry so much. It's amazing. But I'm not going to cry, okay? So Hebrews 7, we'll start in verse 22. Now, listen to these words, okay? And Hebrews 7 says quite a bit of things, but this is the summation of it in 22. This makes Jesus the guarantor, or the absolute certainty, of a better covenant. That's in distinction from the Mosaic covenant. Okay? The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently. I'm going to say that's eternally, because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him. Now, why is that? Now, we all understand that, don't we? That we're saved by Christ. We get that. I would argue that most people even understand this idea of substitution. Okay, they understand that because he died, I can live. Now, here's what I'm trying to get at. And we have to get this. Man, if we could get this, I'm telling you. So, those who draw near to God through him, that's in his substitution. Now, here is in his intercession. Okay, since he always lives to make intercession for them, I'm going to try to hit that home a little bit more in a second. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy. That's the difference, once again, the distinction between him and Aaron. We saw that Aaron had to make atonement for his own sin. Okay, and all these things were set up to basically fail in order to usher in Christ. So he's holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, completely separated. The same God on the mountain on the top, the same separation, okay, and exalted above the heavens, just like the God on the mountain. It's the same God, okay. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all, okay, once for all, when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So, to understand the Bible, you have to understand it progressively. You have to understand it through the lens of Christ. And we have that lens in us. We have that spirit. If we've been born again, we have the interpreter of Scripture inside us. And he does. He leads us. He shows us. So what we have to understand is that God desired Christ to make atonement for man. That's always been the plan. It's quite a simple plan. But he progressively revealed that, and the way that he chose to do that was through a nation. So let's move one more time. This idea of Christ being an intercessor, to constantly make intercession. And I want you to understand, no matter how sanctified you'll become, and I hope we're all on that path to be more like Christ. And that's an amazing thing. That's why we're created, ultimately, to be conformed to his image. Not only in his resurrection, which is what that passage ultimately is described in Romans 8, but to be conformed to his image daily, okay, to be more like him daily. And that's a challenge. So, Hebrews 8, let's just look at a couple of verses since we're already there. Now, the point of what we're saying is this. So, Paul likes to, or whoever wrote Hebrews, likes to really summarize things. As he says, so the point of what we're saying is this: we have the high priest, we have him, and we have him now, and we have him continually. One who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the Majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent, okay, the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. So in the whole chapter of 8 goes on to talk about how all these things were a copy, a shadow of the truth. Not that they weren't true of themselves, but that they were inefficient, that they were given for a certain amount of time. So the main thing to understand here is that Christ is the God on top of that mountain. Is that Christ is the God that reveals the law to man. He reveals it to him. He says, this is me. This is the separateness of me. You can't gaze upon me. You can't touch me. You can't come anywhere near me. And if you do, you're going to die because of who you are. That same God that shows that nation, ultimately shows the world through that nation. That was the idea of it, okay? Preaches the gospel in a primitive sense. It says that here is the issue. Without understanding the issue, you can't understand the solution. So Christ comes in and says, here is the issue here, okay? I'm on top of this mountain. You're on the bottom of this mountain. How are you going to get up there, okay? So he illustrates through the priesthood, this is how you come to the top of the mountain, okay, symbolically. That's why it is a symbol. That's why it was a ceremony. Christ comes down from the mountain, comes on to the earth, and some would argue that he was crucified on the same hill that Abraham offered Isaac, or was going to offer Isaac, in that same place where the ram was caught in the thicket, so Christ was caught on the cross. The same way that the ram laid down his life, Christ laid down his life. Some people say that. I think that makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, this idea of substitution we covered quite a bit. This idea of atonement we covered quite a bit. What we have to understand, and the power that gives us daily to walk with Christ, is the fact that not only has he done those things, as the priest was active daily in the nation of Israel to offer all these sacrifices, which ultimately illustrate the work of Christ. Okay, Christ is active daily in your and my life. He is our constant intercessor. He always stands before God the Father to make intercession for us. That's not going to stop. So when we understand that, what kind of peace do you have? Do you understand that when I pray, my prayer goes directly to God through Christ? There's no in between. There's no lag. When I sin, it's been paid for. So how does that affect your desire of sin? I would argue that when we understand this, we have no desire for sin. Truly. We're going to have to combat that with the flesh anyway. So, not getting off topic. Christ is the purpose of Scripture. Christ's priesthood is what saved us and what keeps us saved. And we've said that many times. But I just think it's amazing to think about. So let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this opportunity to come together. Thank you, Lord, for your word. Please continue, Lord, to show us the truth. Help us to have the life you'd have us to have. Help us to walk the way you'd have us to walk. And help us to do that through the power of Christ. Help us to understand who we are as a church, corporately, and who we are individually. Help us to understand our importance, Lord, to your kingdom. Give us the strength just to be obedient to you and to do it in the right method for the right reason. Lord, help us to understand Christ. Help us to understand his priesthood. Give us the strength, Lord, to teach others about these things and to not be afraid to draw near with confidence, to draw near to others with confidence and boldness. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.